Indian markets joined global sell-off on fears of second wave of coronavirus cases. Key indices trade down close to under % each, but are off the day's low. Supreme Court reduces scope of demand for interest waiver on loans during moratorium. Says court is only questioning if interest must be levied on the delayed interest amount. Banking stocks recover and trade. Reserve Bank's draft paper on tenures of bank CEOs look to cap the term at 10 to 15 years. Analysts say Kotak Mahindra Bank and AU Small Finance may be the first to be impacted, depending on the final form of regulation. And Wall Street Journal reports that US President Donald Trump mulls suspending a number of employment visas, including H-1B. Indian IT sources tell CNBC TV18 that visa renewals may be impacted, but visa out for FY21 will not be affected. The 40th GST Council meeting gets underway. Sources say the Council will consider further easing of compliance burden and the centre and the state's revenue position. Hello and welcome to Business Lunch. Well, before we get to the markets, want to tell all our viewers out there that we have disinfected our studio, all the gadgets that we're using as well, and that's before the start of every show. Now, we have done it. We tell you as well. Please go ahead and take all the precautions, regularly disinfect and sanitize all the surroundings. Well, in terms of the stock markets, we had some news that was flashing for you on the screen. Tata Power, I think we should get that stock up for you. We here at CNBC TV18, had reported this earlier that Tata Power is likely to sell the ships business, and that's precisely what's happened. Tata Power will be selling the ships business for around $213 million. So that's good news from their point of view. The transaction includes freight contracts with the buyers. The sale proceeds will be used to reduce debt. The management has been on our show itself, here at CNBC TV, and they've been telling us that they're looking at selling quite a few assets to reduce, the debt in their books, and that's precisely what's happened. We had broken this just last week or a couple of weeks ago. Kritika Saxena had reported that, so keep that in mind. And in terms of other stocks, actually, yes, the markets are under pressure. But, you have the mid-cap index. Let's just pull up the mid-cap index. And that's encouraging today. The Nifty, if it can hold around these levels of around 9,750 to around 9,800, after the kind of start that you'll have, and you're seeing the mid-cap index recover from the day's low, well, it'll be a fairly okay trading session. I'm looking at a couple of stocks in the broader markets. Info Edge, for the longest time possible, there's been some murmurs that maybe there could be a large trade. Well, I haven't yet seen that. But that stock, in fact, is up close to around 3% as we speak. It's Friday, so let's pull up the Friday stock. You'll get United Spirits up for you. That stock continues to do well. And Granules, after the numbers, the management sounded fairly confident here on CNBC TV18 itself. And from there, in fact, the stock has seen a good rally as well. So volumes picking up on all those stocks. On the broader markets, there is a recovery. Now the mid-cap index is down only around 0.5% or thereabouts. Can we sustain with some of these gains, or will this be a perfect shorting opportunity? Next couple of hours become extremely crucial. But for the time being, holding on to the 20 DMA, the morning's low, that's good news from a bull's point of view. Seen a sharp correction, though, in the last few days. Let's get straight to an important matter now. The Supreme Court has reduced the scope of demand for interest waiver on loans during moratorium. Ashmit joins us to fill us in with the fine print of the court's observations. Ashmit, over to you.
Right, so indeed a big step forward as far as the interest waiver case is concerned before the Apex Court. Keep in mind that the initial issue that had been raised on was on whether or not there can be a complete waiver of interest for the 6-month moratorium period. Now, that had inspired a fair bit of concern within banking circles. The RBI, the banking regulator, had come back to the Apex Court, had said that this is completely unfeasible, that any forced waiver of interest will cause a huge hit to the banking space, to the financial stability of the country, to depositors' interests, and had in fact also even warned that there could be a hit of as much as 2 lakh crore rupees to the banking sector if this is allowed. Now, it is after that we find that the Apex Court is seeking to crystallize its view and limiting the scope. The Supreme Court today clarified that they are not looking at the issue of waiver of interest for across the 6-month period. Rather, the scope of the issue that they're looking at is limited to the levy of interest on deferred interest of the 6-month period. And with that, the Apex Court, in fact, went on to observe to the RBI that this is the scope of the issue, interest on interest, that they're not looking to travel beyond that. that if the RBI travels beyond that, that will lead to a fair bit of opinions and speculation. There will be attempts to sway the RBI's opinion on one side or the other, and that is not the desired impact that the Apex Court is looking to have. So with that, the Apex Court limiting the scope of this question that is before the Apex Court. And as to the question of what next? Well, what next happens is, essentially, the Apex Court has directed for the government over the next 3 days to consult the RBI and to formalize an opinion, formalize a view between the two parties on which is the best way forward as far as the question of interest on interest is concerned. That is something that the Finance Ministry officials will be meeting. The RBI officials will be formalizing a view and coming back to the Apex Court. And that is when on June 17th, that's next week's Wednesday, is when the Supreme Court will take up this issue once again for consideration. Back to you.
Okay, all right. Thanks so much for that, Ashmit. And in fact, it led to a bit of a recovery that we saw in the Nifty. Bank was down 700 points or thereabouts. It's recovered close to around 200 points, now down still around 500 points odd. But let's hop across to Lata. She's joining in with what the Supreme Court observations mean for financials. Lata, over to you.
Well, we have to understand that if a 3-month moratorium is granted and interest is not paid, then that getting interest on that interest tantamounts to an interest-free loan of that period. We have to get that very clear. Now, if that is offered by the banks, that for 3 months you don't pay the interest, and the whole thing can be divided over the next 1 year and you pay it along with your other interest installments, every company in the country will demand that or take that moratorium. You and I as EMI payers should also logically take it, because it actually amounts to an interest-free loan for us. And that remaining money that you get, the 3-month interest, you could put it in the stock markets, you could put it in the bank itself as a deposit, and you will get an interest on it. But you don't have to pay interest on the loan that you are paying. So this is, although it looks like it is restricted, it's definitely restricted compared to the restricted in its damage to the bank and the depositor compared to the previous position where a total interest waiver was asked. Even not charging interest on the interest is to the advantage of the borrower and an undue advantage to the borrower compared to the depositor. The depositor loses. So we have to get that very clear. Banks will be hit even if the interest is waived on that amount of the 3-month interest. The bigger question in all this is a specialist terrain. It is a regulator's terrain, and the regulator is appointed by the executive. You know, who gets what when, how do you distribute the monies in the system, who is taxed and who bears the burden. These are legislative executive questions. These are not judicial questions. And therefore, the larger question is whether this plea should be entertained at all.
Okay, all right. Lata, thanks so much for that. Well, let's move on to another important case in the Supreme Court today. That was the airfare refund case, where the Apex Court has observed that airline companies can provide a credit shell to customers for 2 years, which can be encashed over the next 2 years. SpiceJet, meanwhile, argued that nowhere in the world are airlines issuing full refunds, while the AirStreet told the court that the personal view is fares charged should be fully refunded. The plea will now be heard after 3 weeks itself. A couple of the stocks are under pressure, and post this, the observations that did come in, they have recovered. Case in point being an Interglobe Aviation. I think the stock is on the verge of moving to the green. Even SpiceJet has recovered from the low point of the day. So pull up Interglobe Aviation. A bit of recovery is what we are seeing on that stock as well. Well, let's move on then. And all eyes will be on the 40th GST Council meeting, which is currently underway. Timsi Jaipuria joins us to tell us what is likely to be on the agenda. Timsi.
चलो ना, उस YouTube लिंक में होगा ना सब कुछ. गवर्नमेंट वाला फीड ही ले लेंगे.
All right, I think we'll just reconnect with Timsi in just a bit. She'll be joining in to tell us, what's likely to be on the agenda. I think she's back with us. Timsi, the GST Council meet is underway. Tell us what's on the agenda.
Well, yes, as we speak, the GST Council meeting is underway, and the current discussions are